On the morning of the 27th of August 1896, 5 British warships opened fire on a royal palace in Zanzibar, East Africa. 38 minutes later, the war was over. It remains the shortest war in history. But why did the British Empire bombard an African palace and kill 500 men in a war that lasted less than an hour? For centuries, Zanzibar had been ruled by Arab sultans from Oman. By the 19th century, it had become the main hub of the East African slave trade. The trade made the island both wealthy and powerful, but it also drew the attention of a British Empire determined to stamp out slavery. Growing pressure from Britain led to the sultans curtailing the trade, although thousands of black slaves still worked on the clove plantations on Zanzibar Island itself. And just because the sultans were towing the British line on slavery didn't mean that all Zanzibari Arabs were doing so as well. For years, ships from the Royal Navy played a game of cat and mouse with the slavers still secretly plying their trade, and many men on both sides were killed. But moral crusades were rarely the only motive in imperial politics. As the scramble for Africa gathered pace in the late 19th century, Britain had another reason to keep a close eye on Zanzibar: the growing ambitions of Imperial Germany. In 1890, Britain and Germany struck a deal. Germany would dominate the mainland of what is now Tanzania, while Zanzibar fell firmly into the British sphere of influence. The British now strong-armed the Sultan of Zanzibar to accept British protection to solidify their position. In theory, this meant that Zanzibar remained independent, but could rely on British military support, not least versus Germany. In reality, it meant that Britain was able to exert considerable influence in the running of the state without actually having to spend very much money. Obviously, this all required the acquiescence of the Sultan. And to ensure that happened, in the Protection Treaty, Britain was given the veto on who sat on the throne, which brings us to the shortest war in history. On the morning of the 25th of August 1896, Sultan Hamad bin Thuali suddenly died, aged just 29. Rumours immediately abounded that he had been poisoned by his cousin, Khalid. And there might have been some truth to that accusation. Khalid bin Bagash had been passed over the last time the throne had become vacant, just 3 years beforehand. On that occasion, he had occupied the royal palace in the capital, Stone Town, but had stood down after 200 Royal Marines had been landed by the British. And now, 3 years later, here he was again, claiming the Sultanate, and within a matter of hours, moving his armed supporters into the palace once more and hoisting his flag. The British were not best pleased. Why? Well, firstly, because his actions were in contravention of the 1890 treaty, which stated that the British would decide who sat on the throne. Secondly, because apart from those legal niceties, Khalid was not their preferred candidate. So what was wrong with Khalid in British eyes? Well, basically, the 22-year-old was young, rash, and not as pliable as the British wanted. And by not pliable, I mean he wasn't as keen on abolishing slavery, and the wealth that went with it, as the British were. The very fact that he'd made a play for the throne without abiding by the 1890 treaty proved just how rash he was, or, at least in the eyes of the British consul on the island, Basil Cave. 30-year-old Cave, who'd been representing British interests in East Africa for the previous 5 years, ordered Khalid to stand down. That tactic, backed up by the Royal Marines, had worked 3 years previously, but this time Khalid was in no mood to meekly comply. Instead, he gathered 3,000 armed supporters in the palace. The palace, referred to as the House of Wonders, sat on the edge of the harbour in Stone Town. An impressive structure, it was most certainly a palace and not a fortification, which was a bit of a problem when there were 2 Royal Navy ships facing it from just across the harbour. HMS Philomel, a Pearl-class cruiser from the Cape of Good Hope squadron based out of Simonstown in South Africa, and the gunboat HMS Thrush. That evening, another gunboat, HMS Sparrow, entered the harbour. She joined her sister ship, the Thrush, opposite the royal palace. But was Khalid cowed by this British intimidation? Far from it. In fact, earlier that afternoon, following his predecessor's funeral, he had actually proclaimed himself Sultan. Realising that this time Khalid meant business, Basil Cave now telegraphed the British government in London. Are we authorised, in the event of all attempts at peaceful solution proving useless, to fire on the palace from the men of war? Whilst Cave awaited a response from London, self-proclaimed Sultan Khalid was attempting to solidify his position. Whilst his 3,000-strong army sounded impressive, less than a quarter were trained troops. Those trained troops were, ironically, part of a palace guard that the British had encouraged the previous Sultan to establish. Whilst the majority of this 1,000-strong force had gone over to Khalid, about 400 had remained loyal to their commanding officer, Brigadier General Lloyd Matthews, who also acted as the Sultanate's first minister. The rest of Khalid's army were civilians whom he had rapidly armed. The following day, the 26th of August, the deadlock continued, and two more Royal Navy ships arrived, the torpedo cruiser HMS Raccoon in the morning, and the flagship of the Cape of Good Hope squadron itself, HMS St George, captained by Rear Admiral Harry Rawson, in the afternoon. Born in 1843 in Lancashire, Rawson had joined the Royal Navy when he was 14 and had participated in the famous capture of the Taku forts during the Second Opium War in China. He had taken over command of the Cape of Good Hope and West Coast of Africa station the previous year. Now here he was in Zanzibar harbour with 5 warships with a combined firepower of 70 guns. This was shaping up to be a classic example of British gunboat diplomacy, especially when you consider what the ambitious Khalid had to oppose them. Apart from his 3,000-strong army, which was more Dad's army than elite fighting force, he possessed a single Gatling gun, 2 12-pounder guns, and a 17th century cannon. Now, just to add to the sense of irony, the 2 artillery pieces were gifts from the German Kaiser, and the Gatling gun was a gift from Queen Victoria. Meanwhile, out in the harbour, the would-be Sultan also had the support of the crew of the royal yacht, HHS Glasgow. As the name suggests, the only modern ship of any size in the Zanzibari fleet had been built on the River Clyde in the 1870s. Displacing 1,200 tons and armed with 7 9-pounder guns, she was joined by several steam-powered motor launches and some traditional Arab sailing dhows. Rawson now sent 150 Royal Marines ashore to support Brigadier General Lloyd Matthews and the palace guards who hadn't defected to Khalid. They moved into position around the British consulate and public buildings, whilst Khalid focused his attention on the royal palace on the waterfront. Cave finally received a response from his government in London, authorising him to adopt whatever measures he considered necessary in the firm knowledge that British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury would back him up. However, he was also warned to only take actions which he could accomplish successfully. In other words, don't screw up. Armed with his backing from the imperial government, the British diplomat now turned the screw on the non-compliant Khalid. Within 24 hours, this standoff would erupt into the shortest war in history. 5 Royal Navy warships would bombard the Sultan's palace. The building would be burning within minutes, and less than 40 minutes after the first shot was fired, the war would already be over. At 7 a.m. on the 27th of August 1896, Admiral Rawson sent an ultimatum to the palace, ordering Khalid to haul down his flag and vacate the building by 9 a.m. As the sun rose, the people of Zanzibar nervously watched the clock ticking towards that 9 a.m. ultimatum. And then, with just 1 hour to go, Khalid broke his silence. He told Cave that he had no intention of hauling down his flag. Furthermore, he announced that he didn't believe that the British would actually carry out their threat to fire upon him. You have to admire Khalid's nerve for calling the British Empire's bluff. The only problem with that call is if your adversary isn't bluffing. British civilians were now being hurriedly ferried out to the waiting warships. Meanwhile, a German warship, the Seidler, and an Italian warship, both of which had been assisting the British in anti-slavery operations, tactfully moved out of the harbour. At 9 a.m, 2 bells were sounded on the Royal Navy warships. If Khalid hauled down his flag now, the crisis would end peacefully. If he did not, the Royal Navy would open fire on the palace, and within minutes, Zanzibar and the United Kingdom would be at war. There was a long silence. To avoid any doubt, Rawson waited for the clock on the palace tower to strike 9 a.m. At 2 minutes past 9, the gunboat HMS Thrush fired the first shot of the war. Swiftly, HMS Raccoon and Sparrow joined in, and they were followed by the 2 larger cruisers. Within a matter of minutes, Khalid's artillery, such as it was, had been destroyed. From the harbour, Royal Navy gunners could see flames already spreading through the palace buildings. Through the shattering explosions of British shells, the shrieks of the wounded and the billowing smoke, Khalid and his entourage slipped out of the palace via a side door and fled to the German consulate, leaving his supporters to fight on alone. Out in the harbour, the royal yacht, His Highness's ship Glasgow, took on the Royal Navy, firing her 7 9-pounder guns at the 5 British warships, who immediately returned fire. 2 6-inch shells from the St George holed the Glasgow beneath the waterline, and she rapidly started to sink in the shallow waters of the harbour. Her crew ran up the Union flag as a sign of surrender, and Rawson ordered his ships to rescue what remained of the Zanzibari crew. Barely 10 minutes had passed since the first shot. Elsewhere in the harbour, HMS Thrush sank 2 Zanzibari launches whose crew were firing on her with rifles, whilst another launch, the Twaka, was sunk as she tried to close with HMS Raccoon. Meanwhile, back in the palace, news of Khalid's flight raced through his army. Here they were in a burning palace which was starting to collapse, armed with rifles against warships and abandoned by their leader. The defenders pulled down the Sultan's flag, and at 9:40 the Royal Navy warships ceased fire. The Anglo-Zanzibar War was over. It had lasted just 38 minutes, and as such holds the record for the shortest war in history. Short it might have been, bloodless it wasn't. Densely packed ranks of men in a wooden palace being bombarded with high explosives was a recipe for disaster. 500 of Khalid's armed supporters were killed. The British suffered just 1 casualty. A petty officer on board HMS Thrush was severely wounded but lived to tell the tale. With Khalid's 3-day reign over, within 2 hours the British had installed another member of the royal family on the throne. A sultan who was more malleable than Khalid and more willing to bend to the British desire to stamp out the slave trade. Within a year, the slave trade in Zanzibar had been banned. And what of Khalid? Well, having fled the palace, he made his way to the German consulate, seeking sanctuary. The British-controlled Zanzibar police surrounded the compound and threatened to arrest the errant royal when he left. However, the Germans came up with a cunning plan. The cruiser Seadler, which had left the harbour before hostilities commenced, now moored close to the end of the consulate gardens, and Khalid was able to board without setting foot outside the consulate, thus avoiding arrest. He spent the next 20 years living in German East Africa. During World War I, he was finally captured when the Allies occupied the colony, and was sent to St Helena in the Atlantic, where Napoleon had been exiled, and then to the Seychelles. In 1922, on the orders of the Colonial Secretary, Winston Churchill, he was allowed to return to East Africa. He died in Mombasa, Kenya, in 1927. Zanzibar remained a British protectorate until 1963, when the island was granted independence. During that time, despite black Africans comprising 75% of the island's population, the Arab minority retained political control of the island, whilst Asian immigrants, including the family of Queen lead singer Freddie Mercury, dominated commerce. The independent sultanate lasted a whole month before being overthrown in a bloody revolution by the black population, many of whom were descended from former slaves, and the island joined the mainland Tanganyika to form the Republic of Tanzania. Nowadays, Zanzibar is an exotic tourist destination, attracting nearly 1 million visitors a year. As those holidaymakers wander the winding alleyways of Old Stone Town, they may be surprised at just how Arab this African town looks. They may be upset to see the visible memorials to Zanzibar's slave trade too. And they might be bemused and shocked to realise that they're walking the battlefield of the shortest war in history. All 38 minutes of it. Well, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this story, then why not watch this one too? Before you do that, please make sure that you hit the like button and share with your friends. You can also support my channel by becoming a patron or buying me a coffee. There's details in the description below. And a big thanks to John, Brian and Anne for already doing so. I'm Chris Green, the History Chap. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.